I think you have to be clear about what is actually happening here as opposed to imagining or listening to certain people telling you what's happening. Just as the public here is very often misled as to what the intentions of the Zelensky administration is and what is actually happening. Look, there is an intense political battle still going on in this country after the elections. I wrote in between the two rounds of the presidential election that we could expect revenge, the feeling that the clock needs to be turned back. And the election campaigns were very dirty, both the presidential ones and the parliamentary ones. And what we've seen since is a continuation of this war by other means. Now, the two areas, as you've rightly identified, that Zelensky ran on, his platform involved changing the way things were done, essentially fighting corruption and putting the oligarchs, if possible, in their place, and secondly, looking for some kind of peaceful solution to the war in the east of Ukraine and finding a peaceful resolution, if possible. It's been very difficult to judge his sincerity in fighting corruption. So the easy way of getting at him was to attack him on his patriotism or lack of patriotism as seen, as purportedly it exists. Now, throughout these last few months, there has been nothing that Zelensky has actually said that would lead us to believe that he's about to capitulate. And yet constantly this theme is regurgitated on a daily basis that he's about to sell out. You remember during the elections, he was not just a puppet of Kolomoisky, but he was a puppet of Putin. He was about to cave in. He was about to give the keys to Kyiv and Kharkiv and Zaporizhia to Putin. That didn't happen, as we saw, to the surprise of many, including the skeptics, perhaps not his main opponents and detractors. He stood his ground and he said, I am for territorial integrity, independence, and I'm not going to cave in the East. All this was fine, and it was difficult for his opponents to get at him until this Steinmeier formula was brought up. Now, let's recall what happened. When Zelensky came to power, he, with this overwhelming vote of support, he stated publicly that he wanted to kickstart, if you want, the dialogue with Moscow, but not on Moscow's terms. He was prepared, he said, to meet with Putin, but in the context of the presence of the leaders of France and Germany, the existing format, that is the Normandy format, and that he would try first to gauge what Putin was about, whether there was any inkling, any hope of getting something from him. But at the very least, he would try to free hostages and prisoners being held by Russia. Well, he was successful in the first part, and that was largely, I think, because Moscow wanted to send a signal that it would, on its terms, be prepared to talk with Kyiv. But secondly, of course, the Ukrainians had a key figure in the downing of the Malaysian airline that the Russians wanted back. And so suddenly there was an urgency on their part to have a quick swap and get their man back, right? That could have been damaging for them in The Hague. Clearly, Zelensky felt that there would be momentum after this, that, there had been a start had been made. But suddenly he was confronted with the realities that Putin would play his hard game. And Moscow kept changing the preconditions, the prerequisites for a meeting. At first, Moscow was saying, yes, we'll meet with the new president. But as soon as Zelensky made it clear that he was not about to cave in, as I said, that he would stand on the principles of territorial integrity, no sellout in the East, independence, looking westward, NATO, EU, suddenly Moscow lost interest. What was Moscow going to talk to Zelensky about in an international forum? Remember, for Moscow, it's also quite difficult because Zelensky represents Russian speakers largely. He's a Russophone of Jewish background. And so the argument that this is some raving nationalist who is, persecuting Russian speakers in the East just doesn't make sense. So how, before a world audience, do you meet with the new president who's got this massive vote of support and justify, well, even if you deny your military presence, your support for and your lack of progress in the talks over the last few years? So at that point, as we saw, Moscow kept shifting the goalposts, and Zelensky made an offer of disengagement all across, all down the front line, the contact line as it's called. Russians said no. Then the Russians suddenly brought out the Steinmeier formula. Why was that so controversial? It wasn't really that controversial. It was played up and made into something horrible, into something so frightening by essentially Poroshenko's people, when in fact Poroshenko had agreed to that himself. And now let's get opinions from the experts. For example, ex-Foreign Minister Klimkin, he said there's nothing wrong with the Steinmeier formula if it's the basis for discussion, as long as the sequence in which the various elements of the Steinmeier formula as a catalyst, as one ingredient among many, are applied. So the Ukrainians were very clear. Remember that for 2 or 3 weeks they were reluctant to agree to that. The new foreign minister said, we don't want to agree to this. And that's why the Normandy meeting was postponed from September and is only now taking place. The Russians also agreed at that point to disengagement in 3 pilot spots and dragged their feet on that. The Ukrainians went ahead and said, well, let's do it all along the front, as I've just said. When they agreed to finally have the Steinmeier formula, which essentially says we accept the fact that at some stage elections have to be held in the occupied areas of the Donbass, and that a semblance of, a modicum of self-governments will be applied once these elections are successful. But of course, that's for discussion. The key question is, when will these elections be held, in what conditions? Security, how is security to be guaranteed? In the original Minsk agreements, the armed bands, the armed groupings had to be disarmed and military forces withdrawn from both sides. Plus, the elections were to be held under Ukrainian law, under the Ukrainian constitution, and in the presence of foreign observers, foreign journalists whatsoever. So clearly, by agreeing to the Steinmeier formula as a basis for discussion, that wasn't a sellout. It was, yes, that's on the table. We've agreed to this. Poroshenko's people had agreed to this earlier. We can live with that. But of course, now we have to look at the fine print. When will you guys move out of the Donbass? When can we guarantee security and democratic elections? What's going to happen to the 1.5 million people displaced? How can they be fair elections when 1.5 million, perhaps more, are missing, right? And will we have an amnesty? Well, let's see. Let's see what the crimes are. For certain things, we perhaps can compromise on that, but not for killing Ukrainians, for killing civilians, etc., committing war crimes, whatnot. So that was blown out of all proportion, and I feel that has to be said, particularly to an audience in Toronto or in Canada. Here, it wasn't taken by the vast majority of the population to be such a big deal, but it was constantly being played up by forces that are opposed to Zelensky and want to present him as a traitor, in effect, without having anything to go on. So yes, there will be the 5% or the 2% or the 10% who will express their anger publicly, and maybe a few hundred, a few thousand will come out onto the streets when mobilized. There are people who are genuinely concerned because they don't know. They don't know. They don't know the fine print. They don't understand, and they are patriotic, and so they are amenable to being led down this garden path, shall we say? But it's purely political. There has been nothing in the messages that Zelensky and his team have given that suggests a sellout of the proportions that would alarm us and would set the alarm bells ringing. Today, the president was, it's on Ukrainian Defenders Day today, and he was meeting with the army. The message was, don't believe what you're being told about a sellout. I'm not about to sell you out. What is more worrying, I think, for those who are uncomfortable with the fact that Zelensky, as a political newcomer, is about to meet with Putin in the presence of others, it's the fact that, as I just written this week for the Atlantic Council, this will be the first time that Zelensky is staring this very devious Russian leader in the eye, and it's the first time that he will, even as an actor, he's not allowed to blink. He must not allow the other guy to get the psychological upper hand. So he has to use all his acting skills and play the role to the hilt, even if some of the political and diplomatic finesse is missing because of the lack of experience. However, I think that he has learned lessons very quickly. This has been a steep learning curve the last 3 or 4 months because of, as I've said, the games that the Russians have been playing by shifting the goalposts, saying one thing, then demanding something else at the last minute. There are conditions too that he knows, and as he said in his interview for Time magazine, he trusts nobody anymore. I don't think he's going there with any of the idealistic, perhaps naivety of sorts, let's say goodwill that he had, thinking that he would be as a newcomer, that Moscow would somehow embrace him as an alternative. But he realized that Moscow's not interested in that. If he represents Ukraine's independence, territorial integrity, European course, then he's not welcome in the Kremlin, regardless of whether his name is spelled Zelensky or Poroshenko. So that is the bottom line. And I think that what is important for him is to not rush into anything, not be manipulated into anything, and be very wary of the advice or the encouragement he gets from his partners, the French in particular, and the Germans. To his advantage is the fact that there is this rift between Germany and France at the moment, particularly after Macron's playing up to Putin and his statements, derogatory statements about NATO, and his statements about the need to create a Europe from the Atlantic to Vladivostok, which is essentially just reiterating what de Gaulle said in the 60s. De Gaulle had his reasons to be angry with the Americans and the British, to feel left out, and to want to play a more important role in Europe. But as I also mentioned in an article this week, let's recall that de Gaulle went to Moscow in 1966. He was given the red carpet treatment. 2 years later, Soviet/Russian tanks went into Prague. That was the end of the illusion of a united Europe, because we are not united around values. Even if geographically part of Russia is part of Europe, that doesn't mean that the values are the same and that the mindsets are the same. So that is an important factor. At least the Germans have come around to knowing that they have to defend the idea of NATO more strongly, that they have to try and get Macron back into line somehow to be a team player, especially with the problems that exist with the Trump administration, and so that may work to Zelensky's advantage in the sense that he might not be totally isolated. He will probably feel the pressure from Macron to be conciliatory, as it were. But at the same time, the Germans, I think, at this stage, more so than 6 months ago, will be inclined to back him up and say, pause, think, take a deep breath, don't commit yourself to anything that you're uncomfortable with, because that's going to have repercussions for us. The other factor here is, of course, that Germans have a bit of a guilt feeling in more ways than one. But most recently, it's because they've gone with the Russians for the Nord Stream 2 project. They know that this is very damaging to Ukraine's strategic and economic political interests, and they have bent over backwards to try and show that they are aware of this and that they are not bargaining, but basically pressing Moscow to retain Ukraine as a gas transit country. And so you also have this very difficult context of the ongoing gas negotiations about prices, about routes, etc., which is unfinished business, which may be used by the Germans and by the Russians as a carrot to dangle before Zelensky as something unexpected. But I hope his team have done their homework and are expecting, these sorts of day marches or moves being made. But as I say, a complex situation. And as I've written elsewhere for the Atlantic Council, this summit is not just about Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine is in the center of it, and it stands to lose the most or gain the most. But it's about Europe. It's about where do we stand? Are national interests, read economic business interests of Berlin and Paris, more important than geostrategic ones, European values, the sense of a European family that Ukraine wants to join? Or is it what Macron is suggesting that it's not the values anymore that are important, and even NATO has its day and is probably redundant or obsolete now. For Zelensky to hear that, representing a country that aspires to be a member of NATO, that of course is not very welcome in this situation, which of course works to the advantage of Ukraine, because it's another wake-up call. It helps him dispense with any naivety that might exist and to rethink and, shall we say, retrench his own position. So it's not a given, I would say, at the end of the day, that it's all going to be so easy for Putin. It's a complex situation. There are many other factors involved. Of course, for France with Syria and Germany, Nord Stream 2, etc., etc. It's all about Ukraine on the surface, but it's about the rest of the things as well in that package of issues that are of concern to these powers. And of course, the Americans are not there, but they're very close, watching this closely. The Brits, though preoccupied with Brexit, are also watching this. Certainly, Ukraine's Western neighbors, immediate Western neighbors, the Balts, the Poles, and the others will be watching this very closely. And it's very indicative that the leaders of Lithuania and Estonia advised publicly Zelensky during his visit a few days ago to these Baltic countries not to be taken in, not to concede on anything of principle, and to hold his ground, and assured him that they were with him. So that is also possible. That is also positive, and it suggests to me that what happens on Monday in Paris and the fallout from it will also have an impact on the future reconfiguration of Europe. Let's remember, Britain is withdrawing, Brexit. France and Germany are having something of, it's not so much even an ideological struggle, it's turf warfare. Merkel is weakened, she's on the way out. Both countries have their own economic difficulties, massive strikes again in France, where, as we speak, where Macron needs to placate his domestic constituencies and put business first, as it were. Germany, though it's still the powerhouse, the economic powerhouse, it needs to reassert its dominance, if you want, a soft dominance, but economically backed up in Europe. Until now, the Brits played a very important role in directing, or shall we say, developing foreign policy priorities for the EU, even though they were half in and half out always. But they played an important role in setting the tone. Now it's suddenly left to Germany and France, and you can see that they are pulling in different directions. And this is a moment of truth for Europe too. Will the East and the center also consolidate around the issue not only of Ukraine, but their own self-interests, and create a viable enough strong bloc that will be a counterweight to, say, France, or even Germany if it gets too big for its boots within Europe again. So Ukraine here is for us, it's about independence, territorial integrity, regaining occupied territories. But there's a much bigger game going on, and again, Ukraine is at the center of it.